Carly Shuler with Hoot Reading here, and I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Michael Levine here. He's joining us as part of our series where we're interviewing experts in the field who raise kids who love to read. Michael has been advocating for children's literacy for decades, including time at Sesame Workshop, the Joan Gans Cooney Center, where we actually met, and where the technology that powers Hoot Reading was incubated. And now he heads up Impact and Learning at Noggin at Nickelodeon. Michael, thank you for joining us.
It's such a pleasure, Carly Shuler. Nice to see you today.
You too. Michael is also the author of a book called Tap, Click, Read, Raising Readers in a Digital Age. And Michael, I'm going to ask you a few questions today about how parents can raise kids who love to read. It's obviously a little bit more challenging than maybe it used to be when there weren't as many distractions. So I'd like to start with something that often comes as a surprise for parents, which is that over 2/3 of kids are not reading at grade level by grade 4. But obviously 2/3 of kids are not illiterate. So why is this a statistic that we talk about? What is the 4th grade reading slump, and why is it something parents should be aware of?
Yeah. So first of all, it's just a pleasure to be speaking to you about early literacy, because Hoot is an incredibly important asset in helping families make sure that their children are not only at grade level by grade 4, but soaring beyond. So that's just number one.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the reading slump that we see in the US and Canada and lots of other countries is really quite shocking. Most, parents don't know that well over half of all kids and, well over 2/3 of low-income kids are not hitting their milestones when it comes to making the transition from learning how to read to reading to learn. It's a very, very important distinction. Most kids who are behind at grade 4, in fact, they know how to read a bit, but because what you need to know as a 4th grader is quite a bit more sophisticated than many parents realize, that they are not able to use the reading tool, the reading capabilities, to extend their background knowledge, not able to comprehend the important things that every 8 or 9 or 10-year-old needs to know and be able to do. So that quiet crisis of being behind on the skills of reading, which is a problem, becomes even more fundamentally important when the children can't accelerate their fluency, can't really understand complex vocabulary that's necessary to get ready for school as a preschooler and for life as a middle grader.
Well, that's right. And with a rising 5th grader myself, I saw last year the shift in how she was learning how to read in school to the things she had to read. I mean, you had to be able to read essentially as fluently as I can and comprehend things that even I had trouble with sometimes. So it really was a drastic switch. And I think that I'm really glad you touched on that, because a lot of parents don't know about it.
And now literacy, so those data that you cited about the millions of children who are not up to standard is even more difficult for 2 reasons. Now, one, the information age that we all live in and the different types of literacies that children need to be able to not only be able to, read books, but they also need to be able to navigate successfully on very, very sophisticated, very, very deep internet sites. And they also need to be able to use their knowledge of reading to discern which information is accurate, because there's, so many things that are out there. So there are multiple literacies. And so the crisis becomes even more pronounced if the children don't have those basic, learning to read, reading to learn skills nailed down by the time that they're 8 or 9.
Well, that's right. And I think you explained that really well. So thank you. So a little bit, you touched on singing and talking and the importance of that in early childhood. One thing that I think is so interesting that I've heard you speak about is that even though it's so important to engage in speaking and singing and being with your child, you don't necessarily have to teach them to speak. You don't necessarily have to teach them how to sing. There are things that they just pick up from being around someone who's doing those things. How is reading different?
Yeah, it's such a good point that oral language development obviously is important for reading, but it will not translate into wiring your child's brain to be a capable reader. As Marianne Wolf points out in her incredible book, Reader Come Home, our brains have not evolved in a way that are reading brains. I mean, she points out in her book that in fact we are wiring away because of the interactions we have with all sorts of stimuli that are not books or not reading assignments. We are wiring our brains away, like all the rich media that exists for children, all the games that I was describing before, all the short, takes that children, have in the very, very, rapidly changing, world that we all live in. So reading actually is rocket science in some respects, that there's a very specific formula that, great programs like Hoot Reading and Hoot Tutoring know about, which has to do with the dialogue that needs to go on between the teacher or the adult parent and the child, the sing-song in the back and forth to begin to articulate the words that are in the book. It starts with, letter sounds. It extends to rich, vocabulary and fluency with that vocabulary. There's sight words involved. I mean, there are ways that you need to train the brain, and then with capable tutors and mentors to practice those new skills so that the early adoption of reading, and lots of kids read late and you shouldn't be worried about it because it's naturally other things are going on in their brains, but sometimes you need an extra boost to put together the reading skill set because it does not come naturally, as you suggest in the question. Reading does not come from observation alone. It does not come from listening alone. It comes from blending the knowledge that you get from a rich literacy environment with a very specific skill set.
Well, that's exactly, it leads me into my next question, which I think you sort of answered, but you talked about the two-pronged approach to effective literacy interventions. So what are those two prongs? You talk about that in your book.
Yeah. So my book, which was written with the wonderful Lisa Guernsey of New America, focuses on knowledge plus skills. And what do we need? What do we mean by knowledge plus skills? Well, especially for kids who are just, beginning their academic careers, I just described that there's a set of skills that have to do with, the techniques of reading. That has to do with phonemic awareness. It has to do with, understanding, initial letter sounds. It has to do with a whole range of different, skills that you can learn from practice, but also from, capable mentoring and tutoring. But what really makes reading fundamentally an important lifelong learning exercise is the rich knowledge that it opens up. What I was talking about before, going from the skills of learning to read to reading to learn, that this becomes a fundamental habit of mind, something that is exercised every day. Sometimes it'll be a book, sometimes it'll be a text. So, I mean, there's so many different parts of reading these days. I mean, I think reading of long form in books is down, and that does concern me as somebody who believes in literature. But we shouldn't over worry, especially for younger children, if they are very involved in writing and reading on social media, in comic book form, graphic novels. All the idea here is to get kids into the habit of following their interests. Interest-driven learning and passion-driven learning is what makes children more knowledgeable. It allows them, Carly, to create what scholars call their own islands of expertise. So what you want for a kid is to learn those skills so that we'll be able to create their own passion place.
I love that. I love everything you just said, Michael. Thank you so much. Let me end with one last question. And you've talked a lot about the skills and the knowledge of reading and some of the early foundational things parents need to be doing. But I want to touch on something you just said, which is that maybe kids are reading books less. In your opinion, is it important that children continue to read books, novels, fiction, stories, especially when they get to, that grade 3, 4, 5 level? And if it is important, why do you think that's important when there's so many other types of reading that they can do that are also really beneficial, to your point?
Yeah. All reading matters. So I want to say that first. Like,
Yeah.
let's not be too snobby about this.
Yeah.
However, in my considered opinion, Carly Shuler, reading books is more important than ever now. And I would just submit that for children who are between the ages of 6 and 10, where television offerings and digital offerings happen to be not really that outstanding. I mean, I will say that there's a gap in that time frame. There's a lot of good preschool programming, lots of good educational media in Canada and the US and around the globe. But for 6 to 10-year-olds especially, who are developing their own personalities, their own social identities, their own pair relationships, having the chance to actually stop and read something consecutively for 30 minutes a day, an hour a day, especially during these very stressful times, is something that I think I would just recommend over almost anything else. That a good book takes a child outside of their world into new worlds. It introduces, characters that, prod the imagination and the fantasy, and that actually creates a distance from the every moment stimulation that too many pre-tweens feel like they need to be part of. I think it's an antidote. A good book, especially a nonfiction book, but I love all books, including graphic novels, is an antidote to the must respond every minute, stressful and harried routine of most modern 9-year-olds. And so call me a throwback, but a good old book beats almost anything else.
Dr. Michael Levine, beautifully said. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for continuing to advise us at Hoot Reading. We're so lucky to have you. Thank you again.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you, Carly.